go ahead and get started. First, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us and being here this morning. Welcome to the final of our three-part series of the Andrea Harris Task Force Business Engagement Group DEI Discussion Lunch and Learn. I am Evan Grant, and I serve as the Policy Director for the North Carolina Department of Administration. Aside from serving to enhance the lives of the people of North Carolina by providing foundational support to state government through asset management, advocacy, and operations, the North Carolina Department of Administration maintains a portfolio of boards and commissions, including the Andrea Harris Task Force. Established under Executive Order 143, the Andrea Harris Social, Economic, Environmental, and Health Equity Task Force addresses the social, environmental, economic, and health disparities in communities of color disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. The task force is named in honor of the late civil rights activist Andrea Harris, who dedicated her life to eliminating disparities in North Carolina, co-founding the nonprofit Institute of Minority Economic Development in Durham, and serving as the state's advisory council for historically underutilized businesses. The 5 focus areas of the task force are access to healthcare, economic opportunity and business development, educational opportunity, environmental justice and inclusion, and patient engagement. You can learn more about the Andrea Harris Task Force on the Department of Administration's website. This series of Lunch and Learns was the brainchild of one of our active and engaged members who wanted to strengthen the private-public partnership bridge by aligning the 21 social, economic, environmental, and health recommendations of the task force provided to the governor in 2020 with the work and best practices of private companies in North Carolina. These Lunch and Learns are an opportunity for businesses across the state to discuss some of their successes and challenges when implementing various DEI initiatives within their organization. We hope this conversation will connect businesses, strengthening their ability to practice in these areas where they find struggle to adopt these practices. It will inform state agencies on potential avenues for implementation and encourage all the participants here to advocate for DEI initiatives within their organizations. The Andrea Harris Task Force under Executive Order 143 did sunset at the beginning of this month. However, our office, along with the Office of the Governor, are working diligently to reestablish the task force to continue this great work. Again, I would like to welcome you to day 3 of the Lunch and Learns. Our topic today is diversity, recruiting, and hiring and on-the-job training. And with that, I will pass it over to Justin Truesdale, who is our Business Engagement Chair, to discuss the Business Engagement Group and his purpose and vision for this series.
Thank you, Evan. Again, welcome to our third and final of 3 total diversity, equity, and inclusion discussion Lunch and Learns. I'm Justin Truesdale, a lawyer here at Smith Anderson Law Firm here in Raleigh, and chair of the Business Engagement Group. As we've noted before, the task force was formed to address the social, environmental, economic, and health disparities in communities of color in North Carolina. Since being formed, the task force has worked on a number of recommendations and action items to help improve in the areas directed by the governor's executive order. Upon beginning this work, the task force leadership recognized that many of the issues it identified were being addressed from a public government standpoint and didn't want to overlook the role that the private sector in North Carolina could play in helping address these issues. So the Business Engagement Group was formed to help with engaging the North Carolina business community to aid in tackling issues from a different angle. The Business Engagement Group decided that having a series of DEI virtual Lunch and Learns would allow us to connect businesses across our state with other businesses and public entities that have adopted DEI programs that have thrived and had positive outcomes. As I've said before, diversity, equity, and inclusion is an area where companies shouldn't be competing, but where companies would mutually benefit from others adopting similar programs. And we think this venue is a place where everyone can connect and learn from each other. Today's Lunch and Learn will be centered on diversity, recruiting, and hiring, and on-the-job training. We'll hear from 3 leaders in diversity, recruiting, hiring, and integration, each with unique perspectives. With that being said, thanks again to everyone for attending. And I would like to pass the mic over to our moderator for today's panel, Tanya Smith, to introduce herself and panelists to begin the conversation.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Welcome. I am Tanya Smith. I serve as the Director of the Office of Civil Rights at the North Carolina Department of Transportation and Chair of the NCDOT Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Advisory Group. It is my honor and privilege to welcome you to the Andrea Harris Task Force Business Engagement Lunch and Learn series. I will serve as moderator for today's diversity, equity, and inclusion discussions. With progress comes disruption. The question is, how do we truly achieve diversity, equity, and inclusion? How do we pivot our work, dismantle systems, and break through systems that prevent meaningful progress? How do we disrupt unconscious biases plaguing our workplaces? What innovation and strategies are within our individual reach? Under the leadership of Secretary J. Eric Boyette and Deputy Secretary Ebony Pittman, NCDOT is committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. We want North Carolina to be a model state in workforce development. Today, you will hear from a diverse group of panel members to speak about their organizational strategies and dynamic efforts towards equity and inclusion in the workplace. First speaker we have for today is Ms. Shea Albright. Ms. Shea Albright is a diversity strategic recruitment partners manager who works with underrepresented communities and individuals to thrive in the tech industry. With 13 years in HR, Shea takes a passionate, strategic, and sustainable approach to DEI. She believes ensuring education, resources, career paths, and opportunities is key to diversifying organizations. In the words of Shea, diversity is not just about one's demographic, but the difference in perspective that can drive innovation. Next speaker we have is Wesley Jackson Wade, PhD, owner, Forward Counseling and Consulting, student and former career services counselor for students who are neurodivergent. Wesley Jackson Wade is a licensed clinical mental health counselor, a licensed clinical addiction specialist, a certified clinical mental health counselor, and a national certified counselor. He owns and operates Forward Counseling and Consulting, collaborates as a neurodiversity consultant with Genius Within, and serves on advisory councils for NeuroGuides and the Lego Foundation. Wesley has 9 years of corporate experience and 7 years of experience working in higher ed, where he led career programs for autistic students and partnered with the Black Male Initiative. Currently, Wesley is wrapping up a PhD in counseling and career education from NC State University. Our next speaker we have joined with us today is Dr. Craig Wiley, Project Manager, Unlock the Box, Campaign Against Solitary Confinement, Disability Rights, North Carolina. Dr. Craig Wiley served 8 years in New York State prison system and an additional 4 years under community supervision. He returned to the community in 1997. Since returning to the community, Craig earned a bachelor's degree in health science, a master's degree in mental health counseling, and a doctorate in executive leadership. In addition, he has worked as a substance abuse counselor with people mandated to treatment as a reentry case manager, and in higher education as an adjunct professor and academic coordinator for the first generation college students, and as a postdoctoral fellow at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill in the Department of Social Medicine in the Re-envisioning Health and Justice Lab, researching the intersection of health and mass incarceration. Craig currently works with disability rights in North Carolina as a project manager for Unlock the Box, UTB as they refer to it, Campaign Against Solitary Confinement. Welcome. Are you all ready to get started, panelists, on some great conversations? Wonderful. So I will start with our first panelist, Ms. Shea. And I will have to say, Ms. Shea, I love your background, and I see a red hat in the back. Is there any story behind that?
Yes, it's one of the things we all look forward to at Red Hat. After you complete your onboarding, typically you receive a red hat to make you an official Red Hatter.
Okay, so I'll call you Miss Shea the Red Hatter. Okay, let's get started. So the first question I have of the panel is what is one breakthrough innovation you've seen in the workplace or workforce development strategies that has inspired you? And either one of you, Wes, Craig, or Shea, can jump right in.
I would say one of the most breakthrough is changing the perspective from DEI to IDE. Obviously, diversity is important, but first you have to make your organization inclusive to actually attract, retain, and help grow diverse candidates within your organization. So that's something that I think is starting to take more traction within all fields, whether it's tech, whether it's healthcare. You're starting to see the change of how they approach diversity. Really taking an inner look into the organization, the structure, the leadership, and the culture, and starting from the top down to really develop what that looks like. How are they not only attracting diverse candidates, but how are they helping them grow their careers? And then also looking at moving from a transactional recruitment, where it's more of applying to a position, having that first initial conversation, and going through the process. It's more of relationship recruiting, really getting to know candidates, understanding what their passion is, and then moving from there to not just letting them think of only in the box of that one position, but really helping them understand their skill sets and how they can grow and offering other opportunities within the organization.
Wonderful, thank you. Wes, do you have any add-on to that? And also, in your opinion, what can companies do to make the hiring process more equitable and diverse?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much here. So at the beginning, I would say, similar to what Shay was saying, a focus on some of the internal efforts that's going on. So a lot of my work has been with neurodivergent communities, and just like for FYI, when I say neurodivergent, it's like part of the neurodiversity theory, and so we have folks who are neurotypical, which is typically folks who do not have some type of neurological condition like ADHD, dyslexia, autism, anything like that. So I'm ADHD myself. I fully disclose that. Definitely have a learning disability as well. So when I say neurodivergent, those are those folks who diverge from like the typical, statistically typical cognitive profile. So when I work with neurodivergent populations, and you see a lot of over the past 4 years, initiatives for neurodivergent populations. I don't know if you can hear this. My kids playing video games. Sorry. Neurodivergent populations. There's a lot of effort on recruiting, right? And that's good. And we do need that. But there's also been within some organizations a switch to look at a top-down model and more introspective on their internal culture and policies. That is where it starts, because you can recruit someone, right? We're like, okay, this is important. We're going to recruit someone who's neurodivergent. We're going to make this an intentional process. But then you bring this person on, they're like, well, where's the supports? Where's everyone else? How come my manager doesn't understand the differences and the needs that I have in this space? And so taking a look at the internal piece is not always as like attractive on a PR lens, because you can't really talk about it. It's going on internally. You don't have these publicized campaigns to say, hey, we're recruiting this, we have this special lane. So you don't always get to see it as much, or there's not as much of a reward, I would say, in a superficial sense for some organizations. So when I see that, I know that someone has spent some time thinking about this, right? And this is an approach that shows that maybe we've tried something else, or we've thought about this, and we're really trying to get this right. So I don't know if it's necessarily innovative, but it's been newer for some organizations to approach it like that. So that's what I will say for that.
Wonderful, thank you for your perspective. Dr. Craig.
Yeah, just kind of following up. Can you hear me? Because I
I,
seem to be frozen in my picture there.
yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so yeah, so just kind of following up with what Wes and Shay talked about. I'm thinking also about the importance of diversifying, or companies diversifying their outreach channels. Like not just looking in the same old places for talent, and start to look in different places to perhaps attract different types of people or diverse candidates. And another thing that comes to my mind is also understanding that talent can come from anywhere and it can look almost any way. And so I think it's important for employers and organizations not to get caught up on a cookie cutter look or a stereotypical approach or presentation of a potential employee. And then lastly, I think it's also important, again, kind of following up with what Wes and Shea said about the importance of companies reflecting on their current hiring practices and being more cognizant of perhaps where bias may be getting in the way of hiring fairly. So those are just some things that come to mind as I listen to our fellow panelists.
Wonderful. Thank you. Uh, Let me ask a question. Maybe Shay or Wes. What's a workforce development strategy that you think is dead or dying, and what should replace it? What suggestions do you have for companies or organizations who want to diversify their staff pool, their talent pool?
You mind if I hop in, Wes?
Go for it. Go for it.
So I recently was talking about this. Obviously, we are in Pride Month. So you see a lot of, if you're on LinkedIn, people repurposing their logos into the Pride flag and showing support. One of the things that I think organizations really need to look at is, yes, these months are created, Black History Month, Asian Network Month, things of that extent, to really shine light on the challenges that they have faced throughout history to get to where they are. But it comes off in almost performative when we see these things happen, because it should be consistent throughout all 12 months. So your support should not only be heightened in the month of June or the month of February, it should be heightened every single month for each and every diverse individual. And that's something that I think is not, brought up enough. And that's a challenge that I think as all of us are facing within HR and within organizations, is how do we show that support on a consistent basis to all individuals, and not just, in a sense, show it just for that month. Obviously, companies are doing things on a consistent basis, but how do we amplify that to show that we are inclusive and that it's not just the performative method for us to change our logos on LinkedIn and post on Instagram. So that's something that I think really needs to be looked at internally with all organizations across the board.
That is a great point. I always say I am female 12 months out of the year, not just for that 1 month, and all of my other diversity associations. So thank you for bringing that to our attention. Wes, how about you?
I mean, I agree with that wholeheartedly. Here we are on Juneteenth talking, we've seen the ads for Juneteenth ice cream brands and all this other stuff. Like, let's be authentic in these spaces. So yeah, I appreciate that. What I would add to it from my perspective and some of the work I've been doing over the past few years is I don't know if it's always been thought of as a workforce development strategy, but from my perspective and working with some Fortune 500 companies and universities, I definitely think it is. It is removing the workplace rigidity that so much of us have been used to, right? I'm not going to try to paint a silver lining on the pandemic, because it has been horrible for the overwhelming majority of us, especially those of us who have lost, friends and family members during this time. If you have some privileges during this time, or you have some comfort within your workspace, and maybe you've been able to change how you work or have some flexibility in your work, a lot of us have realized I can actually manage some of these aspects of my life. My wife and I, we both work full time here in North Carolina. We have 2 kids under the age of 6. That's a lot going on, right? Even if you don't have kids, there's a lot going on. But to juggle all of these schedules and all the responsibilities you have at work, and none of us are really working 40-hour weeks. We're usually working a lot more. We're putting in after-hour workshops and presentations and all these things, especially if you're working with students and other things of that nature. And so, how do we construct a work workplace culture, a dynamic that meets the needs of everyone else, right? We work on different schedules. So some people are real early risers and they like to have some flexibility. Some people want to be in the office every day. Some people want some disconnect. And I understand that not all workplaces or all organizations are designed to be able to operate in that way. But the overwhelming majority, I would say, are just pulling from the top of my head. So thinking about, okay, like what do we really need from the folks in our staff here, right? Like what are their responsibilities? How are they producing? How are they collaborating? What are new ways that we can connect? And that has been I would say a huge benefit to folks in the workplace. Like you already see, the great resignation, whatever you want to call it, right? People are leaving for a multitude of reasons. A large reason is, hey, I need more flexibility. It's a lot easier to even do things like maintain the organization of your home when, hey, I got an hour between meetings. I can do my dishes right now instead of waiting till I come home and I'm exhausted. That might sound like very basic, but that's real. We all have lives to maintain, and there's a lot of energy that comes into maintaining those lives, getting our cars fixed, getting our registration done, right? Doctor's appointments and visits, being able to do those things in between meetings during the day, but having the trust from your organization that you are doing this work, that is huge. That changes the dynamics of the workplace that we have, which, by the way, this is not a new conversation. The United States has been having this conversation since the 70s about possibly doing a 4-day or 3-day work week, but it goes away in the name of let's grind it out and make more money, right? So I love that these conversations are at the front and center of not just recruiting, but developing your existing workforce and taking an honest look at like, how does this impact retention, the bottom line, employee morale? These are all important strategies for developing not just an engaged workforce, but a diverse workforce as well.
Wow, I think you have a lot of people who are probably applauding those statements about being able to manage the organization of your household. I can truly relate to that. So thank you for saying that. I'm going to ask the question of Craig of you a little bit differently based on the work that you do. And then Shea, maybe too, if you can loop in on the tail end of this. Share an example of a failed workforce development approach. And what should we learn? What are employers doing wrong that we need to change? What are the populations we're missing?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Tanya. And looking at or reflecting on my own experience in my own life, I think who employers are missing, in large part, are those folks who are returning to the community post incarceration. I think we have lots of skilled men and women who are coming home from prisons and jails, who are looking for a second chance at life. And oftentimes, I think their success can be recognized or realized if given an opportunity. Unfortunately, there's lots of bias and discrimination placed or leveled against people who have criminal convictions and people who are coming back to the community from prisons and jails. But I think that that's a large population. And just to share about my own experience with incarceration, I'll tell you, during the 8 years that I served in prison, I met some of the most brilliant men that I've ever met in my life. I've been out well over 20 years, and still many of the people that I met in prison were some of the most brilliant and skilled. As far as academics, electrical skills, philosophy, building maintenance, organizational thing, anything that you need to run a community or run an organization or a household, etc. I found many people inside the prison had the skills to do that and probably could outshine many of us who have our sophisticated degrees.
Wow. So I can totally relate to that. And speaking to incarcerated individuals and visiting them in prison to understand why they're incarcerated, I was really surprised at, who gets incarcerated in the first place. and the stigmas that are associated. So I do appreciate what you're saying. There are some brilliant people who are there, and they're not someone who cannot contribute to society. Shea, in pivoting in that, what can the workplace do? What can employers do? How could we be an advocate and champion for inclusion, especially with populations that may have been excluded over decades or centuries? What can we do?
I think some of the challenges really lies with just, if we're being honest, unconscious bias. When people hear unconscious bias, they always, assume it's based on race or gender or some types of discrimination. But no, it be something simple as, having an affinity effect or something to that extent, where you're looking at individuals who are similar to you, similar backgrounds, similar companies that they previously worked at. And that prohibits a company from being innovative, because you need different perspectives, different experiences, different learning experiences to continue to grow an organization. One thing that I do, and of course I'm going to talk about Red Hat because I'm absolutely in love with the organization. One thing that I do respect that they do in two avenues is, the first one is, when it comes to certain roles within our organization, we do not have certain stipulations around how you apply or what your background looks like, or whether you have a degree or whether you've been incarcerated, and those type of things, I think, prohibits unconscious bias. The other thing is the ability to really take your career how you see fit. So a lot of organizations still have this hierarchy mindset, top down. In my company, it is not unheard of to hear an associate have a meeting with executive about opinions, ideas that they are bringing to the table. Open source does not only apply to our technology, but to the organization as a whole. And I think that's what motivates and drives everyone. And you start to see the career progression, because their wheels are turning. They're bringing new ideas to the table. They're able to collaborate despite where they came from, despite their demographics, just, based on their skill sets and their passion. And that's something that companies don't do enough, is create a system or create an interview process or a hiring process where we are in the early stages blocking unconscious bias, and then continuing that process into the organization and the infrastructure of how we develop our actual associates and employees.
Yeah, that's a good point. From a corporate perspective, you talk about the application process,
Correct.
right? What are some of the barriers that you see commonly in large companies, public, private sector, that actually prevent people? We talk a little bit about, the checking of the box. I mean, those questions that we ask during the application process. What are some things that you see that create barriers?
That's a tough one. So some of the things that I see that often create barriers in corporate organizations, in previous companies that I've been in, there has been, of course, the background checks, the drug screenings, especially if you are a national or a global organization, that can be a bit of a challenge. The mandatory of degrees or mandatory of specific certifications or experience, that has been a challenge. And I think most importantly, the biggest challenge I see, especially when it comes to diverse individuals, is organizations, how they position themselves when recruiting or interacting with diverse candidates. Oftentimes, we'll be a little bit hesitant. I know I have done this in the past myself, when we see that check the box, are you African American, Hispanic, and check unknown or other, or I choose not to disclose. So to me, it's just how we make the verbiage in that initial process to be inclusive. How do we attract our talent without putting these barriers and guardrails into what type of talent we want to bring into our organization? So it all starts really with the initial application phase, and how it's worded. Is the language inclusive? Are we really looking at what our requirements are, what our process is? Are we weeding out talented individuals based on our own bias? So that's where the first step you want to take in the recruiting process, to try to create a, unconscious bias process.
Wonderful, thank you. Wes and then Craig, you talked about the neurodivergent population, incarceration. What's the biggest and common misconception that you hear about workforce diversity and the emerging of workforce diversity?
Say that for me one more time. Not that you said it wrong, like, and this is here's like a great example of like neurological differences. So I'm ADHD, I'm hypercontextual, so I think about all these different pieces of context, right? And Craig and Shea had some really great things. My brain was going on all these pieces, and then you said that, and I'm trying to like reel it back in and think about this. This is part of like processing speed that we would say when it comes to cognitive things. So just like for an example, if you're in a meeting and you ask a question, like a work meeting, I'm not picking on you, Tanya, at all. Like take time to give people time to process. Give like 60 seconds so people can think about this, or present some questions before the meeting starts so people can think about it. Not everyone is always just spitting out the answers that quickly, and it does, just because you're not doesn't mean the answers aren't good. I see so much context. It takes a little bit of time to process it sometimes. That was just a good iteration. I had to like put that in there. I did not mean to cut you off, but could you give me that question again, please?
Great lessons learned. Thank you. So, what are the biggest and most common misperceptions about workplace diversity? What do we get wrong? And you just mentioned one, so that's a good segue into, you know, how to manage someone who's in a certain grouping. So you talked about neurodivergent and the ADHD. So you just brought a good example about giving people time to think. It's, maybe that's a management style.
There are so many misconceptions. It's hard to pick one. So like I think one that is like calling out to me right now is the indicator that like different approaches, thinking differently about something is bad, or it's not as good as another way of thinking. This is part of what neurodiversity really means. Like neurodiversity is really it's a theory, it's a critical theory, and it has three parts to it. And it really focuses on the fact that there is neurological diversity within people's brains and how we think and how we process information, and that while there is a societal hierarchy, that is artificial. There should not be one. We all have value for how our brains process information. There might be different situations where someone's cognitive process might provide a greater strength than someone else's, but that is a situation, right? There's another situation where that's going to be balanced somewhere else too. So what tends to happen sometimes, and by the way, like a quick side, a large portion of the incarcerated population is neurodivergent. There's a reason for that. All right. So like Dr. Craig, you and I are gonna have to talk after this, because I see some overlap that we got coming. But like something that happens in the recruitment process a lot, right? So let's say there's like this special lane. Okay, we're gonna specifically target candidates who are autistic, right? Now we bring them in, and what I'll hear from people sometime is, well, we have to find a role that's right for them. Ask yourself, what does that mean? Like, we really need to be honest and reflective and like remove some of our pride from this situation. If you really want to do DEI work, whatever you want to frame it, it's a matter of being internally reflective. Like what does it really mean when I say we have to find a role for that person, right? What you're saying is you don't think that they can have some of these other roles. I am just as capable. My autistic, ADHD, dyslexic students, the ones who have Tourette's, and by the way, I use identity first language. This is a part of neurodiversity theory, as opposed to like person first language, like a person with autism or ADHD. And I don't fault anyone for doing either way. That is how I frame these things. But we can do all of those roles. And by the way, we're already in your organizations doing this work right now. Whether we realize we're neurodivergent or not, a lot of us are masking, which is kind of a version of code switching, where we're hiding, we're pretending to be neurotypical. And without going too far on, one of the big pieces here with this of this misconception of strengths, and there's one right way to do things. When you want to look at it like a quantitative lens of like, how do we really define like who is neurodivergent, who is neurotypical, there's the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale can depict a good example of this. And you don't have to know all this stuff, but basically it's just an assessment that shows like different strengths that you have on a cognitive level. Look at like perceptual reasoning, verbal reasoning, processing speed, which I mentioned earlier. And the fourth one is escaping me now. I can't think of it for some reason. But there's disparities between these for folks who are neurodivergent. So if you're neurotypical and you score on this, you take that assessment, I put your scores on a graph, and I drew a line. I connected all those dots. The line is relatively flat. Like there's some disparity, but it's relatively flat. You're pretty balanced. And that has strengths and weaknesses as well. For someone like me who's neurodivergent, we have what's called a spiky profile. So like my perceptual reasoning is way up here, right? In my working memory. That was the other one I couldn't remember. It was working memory. And so like working memory is down here, right? So that is not a strength of mine, but this is a strength, right? And that doesn't mean it's better or worse. That means there's certain situations that are I'm really good at. Big picture situations, seeing the progression of things, how people interact and work together. So we have to really embrace the differences in not just like who we, and Shea, I think you said this at the beginning, it's not just who we are demographically, but who we are cognitively, how we think. These are different strengths that we have, right? Let's take away the deficit lens and start thinking about the strengths that people have that you might not understand, right? So be willing to learn these things.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. I've just learned quite a few things. I'll pivot to Craig. So, what's the biggest misconceptions about workplace diversity, and in particular, working with individuals who were previously incarcerated? What do we get wrong in our thought process?
Yeah, well, first, thanks again, Tanya. I just want to say, Wes, you really spit fire there, man. I mean, like, you really just blew me away, so thank you for that learning opportunity. Um, but back to the question, Tanya. So I think when we're talking about people who have been formerly incarcerated, I think, again, one of the things that is often a misconception is that these people or this group of people, this demographic, are not intelligent or unskilled or are not hardworking or don't want to work and have very little to bring to the table and or are not trustworthy. And so I think these misperceptions in many cases or these biases cause people to be excluded from the hiring process or even being considered, but some of the other, I think, general misperceptions about workplace diversity is that, oftentimes people think that most companies are already pretty diverse, but if we really think about it, many industries are still pretty homogenous, like for example, I think there's like a very low percent, maybe 5 to 7% of Black tech workers in the U.S. Are there, or should I say, yeah, there's about 7% of Black people working in the tech force in the U.S. And then, we think about lawyers, because we're talking. One of my things is talking about, legalities and incarcerated people. I think 80 to 90% of lawyers are white people. Another misperception might be workplace diversity is just about race. Who's Black, who's white, who's brown, who's Asian. But folks are not thinking about, employees who are maybe of different ages, different genders, different sexual orientations, disability or ability status. So I think it's important that employers also consider cultural and ethnic backgrounds as an important aspect of diversity, but also consider these other issues or these other points of identity. And then, I think the last thing I'll close with is, um, folks think that hiring a diverse workforce is enough. And when I say folks, that's pretty generic when I say that, but just, including that in the conversation, workforce or workplace diversity also includes creating, and I think Shea talked about this earlier. It's about creating an inclusive environment, basically where differences are celebrated, but celebrated year round, 12 months a year, because you're Black 12 months a year, you're gay 12 months a year, whatever that case is, and then also not just celebrating the differences of people, but also recognizing barriers and systemic injustices. Um, so yeah, thank you for your question.
You're welcome. Thank you for the insight. That's really been informing to me. I want to kind of ask all three of you a question, and I'll start with Shay. And it's a bit personal in nature, but can you speak to us about what impact workplace diversity has had on you in your career? How did your work get you to the place that you are today?
Yeah, so for me, I actually started out in the military. I served 12 years, and I served 12 years recruiting. And in that structure, I did see how, and that was my first job ever coming out of, high school. But I was able to see how different backgrounds, different, experiences come together to bring something bigger to the picture. And that's all I knew, and it was all I was passionate about. So when I left the military and I went to what we call the civilian workforce, it was very different for me. It was very different to see, less camaraderie, less support. It was very different for me to see, just how difficult it was as a veteran, as a woman, as a person of color, to be recognized for my work, to see that progression in my career. And then, with me, I'm very much, since I'm in recruiting, a networking person. So hearing the same stories constantly come up, come up, come up. And what I started to do is within every organization, I would try to break that barrier, try to do something with DEI, create my own DEI efforts, find nonprofit ways to implement it so that way I don't have the organizations push back. But I would see it would never be adopted. It would always be, oh, that's nice. That's something we should think about in the future. And I'm like, it's not something that should be a goal. DEI should never be a goal. It should never be an initiative. It should be a fixture in every organization. It's what is represented in the communities. And that really kind of drove my passion. That really started getting me, thinking about DEI in a bigger picture. How can we do so much better? I had one instance where I was in a role and I felt like I hit that ceiling, and this is quite often, especially for women and especially for diverse individuals, where you are in a corporate structure and you kind of hit this glass ceiling where you feel like you have to push, you have to kind of code switch, you have to sit there and have these different identities to try to break and move into management, move into leadership. And I was having such an issue with that. And I started to lose my passion. I started to lose being innovative. I started holding back from bringing ideas to the table. And then when I switched to my current organization and I saw just how, much I can do and how much me being a diverse individual, diverse perspective was appreciated. It drove me even more to become so passionate about what I do. People always ask me, they're like, how did you grow so fast within your career? Every time someone looks at my LinkedIn, and I'm like, the passion. And that's something that I think organizations really need to look at is if you have individuals who are talented and you are investing in them, regardless of their background, regardless of the situation, if you have individuals that are individual with a disability or cognitive disability, being able to adjust their role, adjust the position so that they are able to work better, be able to provide accommodations and see them thrive, you'll see the change in your organization. You'll see the growth. You'll see it goes from being entry level where you're pretty heavy as far as diverse to entry level to where you start to see that movement into management. You start to see that movement into the director leadership and so forth and so on. So I think that's what drove me, is just really switching from being an organization that was really kind of structured and diverse to moving into a civilian world where it was just barrier after barrier and challenge after challenge. And it continues to drive me. So that's something that I think really, really motivates me to try to see a change, not only within my company, but also in the work that we do. So.
Thank you for sharing that. Wes, how about you? How has workplace diversity, what impact has it had on you in your career? Tell us about you a little bit.
Wow, I will try to keep this answer constrained here. There's so much, right? I was talking to a group of students who were doing an internship with the INSERP. I forget what it stands for, but my friend Dr. Michael Johnson runs this. It's a virtual internship program for underrepresented students in sciences, and it's throughout the U.S. It's third year. He's got grant funding from NSF. It's a great organization. And I was talking to the students there, and I had this great introduction. They're rattling off all these things that I do, and it was like, we could introduce this another way. I could introduce how I've struggled in areas of my corporate career, how I've had issues with certain managers because I just couldn't communicate with them effectively. There's a lot, and there's a lot behind that is related to diversity. And so, for me, I didn't always understand my how my ADHD brain works. I didn't even fully own and recognize that, honestly, until I did a career change and I became a mental health counselor. So the way that diversity has impacted me, like in my career progression, is taught me like the need for it, and like some of my own areas of shortcoming. Like I have to constantly check myself and like review, like, well, why am I really thinking this? What am I really doing? Am I doing the same thing to someone that I got frustrated that someone else was doing to me, because I know that it was limiting me. So an example, I definitely won't say the name of the organization, but I was working for an organization. This was different career, 2 or 3 careers ago. This was my corporate career, and I was doing business to business sales at this point in time. And I was good. Once I had switched like the industry within B2B sales, I kind of had this reputation of being in the top 1 to 3% within the group, within the first 3 months. And then after this, I'm driven to the point of just wanting to leave. And when someone like me who's ADHD, when you get disengaged, it is a whole different level of disengagement. And disengagement comes from me not being interested, not being stimulated, or I feel that there is some kind of like unjust act going on, and I am like disconnected at this point. So working like in a rigid structure where we're like, hey, you need to make a certain number of dials a day, and that means that you have a certain number of meetings, and that means those meetings turn into a certain number of advanced meetings and then deal closures. Well, I think like the average number was like 70 or something. You're supposed to have around 70 dials a day. You know how many I had? It was like 20. But I had more time on the phone because I would have real conversations with people and trying to understand what their business is. And so my numbers were great at that point. And I had like a manager who would come to me and say, well, if you were, I mean, look how good you're doing now. Imagine if you were doing 70. And I didn't understand what I do now. Like now I understand why I felt the way that I did. But the way that I explained it to him, he was a big NBA fan. This was years ago. And I said, look, you wouldn't go up to Shaq and say, Shaq, man, if you could play more like Kobe, you know how good you could be. Shaq has his game. Kobe had his game, right? Like we don't like, let's look at the strengths of people. Like this is a part of diversity. It's not trying to say this is the cookie cutter process that everyone has to follow. We're following the data, and we have this misconception that data is unbiased, and that but how we interpret data or the questions we ask for what data we pull has bias based into that. So sitting here saying $70, it's just way too much energy and focus for me. Like I got 3 solid hours where I can do this and I can have some great meetings. Like let's do this. And by the way, I was also really good at helping some of the younger folks around me develop their communication styles and ask better open-ended questions. So maybe if that was seen, right, there would have been a different role where I could have done some internal training for communications, because I was also a little older than some of the folks on the team. So it's the lack of embracing what diversity really means, that it's not just this statistic of, okay, how many women, how many Black and brown folks do we have? Do we have some safe roles for people with disabilities? Like that's the idea of it. Like, no, this is not the approach that we have. And so As you can tell, like I have some soapboxes that I like to climb on. I can get very passionate about stuff. So that fire has ignited all of the other areas that I do, right? Because I'm like, I am never going to let people who work under me or with me experience this. I will advocate for these things. And it turns into being a counselor, it turns into doing research in these areas, it turns into consulting in some of these fields. So that is how I would say the lack of diversity, the issues with not approaching diversity correctly, that is the impact that it had on me. Was it lit a fire under me to make a point that this is a lot deeper, and honestly it's not really as difficult as people make it out to be.
Thank you for sharing. And I wanted to take a moment to also say, joined on the call today, we have several of our interns, including our HBCU interns that just started this week at NCDOT. So I believe they're listening to what you're saying and they're really absorbing it. But do know your words are really impacting the next generation. So I appreciate you sharing so candidly. Craig, why don't you share your experiences and your thought process of how you feel your career has been shaped?
Yeah, and again, thanks, Tanya. Um, I think in large part my career um, has been shaped a lot, mostly by my own efforts to do better for myself post incarceration, and to also set examples for other formerly incarcerated people who are returning to this community after serving time in prison. And so, one of the big things that was very important to me in shaping my career was pursuing higher education. And so, in many of the higher education classrooms or on campus, I was one of few people who had experienced incarceration. But again, this was something that I would always let people know. So, despite the stigmas that might follow being incarcerated, I wanted to let people know that though you've had these experiences with the criminal legal system, that you can rise above these things and you can circumvent them, circumnavigate them, and become much more than you ever could imagine. And at the same time, moving into the world of professional work, again, often I was the only person um, who had come from a criminal legal background, who had been on parole, who had served time behind the wall. But again, always trying to lay the groundwork for perhaps maybe the next justice impacted person who's coming behind me. And so really my whole objective has been to shine a light on the strengths of people who have been inside prisons and jails, and using my life and my experiences and my work as that example, as that template for people to follow, so that perhaps future employers, current employers, after experiencing me or working with me, might give the next formerly incarcerated person a chance because they saw me come through. They've experienced me. And one of the biggest things that I think that has really helped me find my way into different places where perhaps other formerly incarcerated people haven't been, has been, I believe, my ability to make myself vulnerable and to put myself out there and to not be afraid of whatever blowback, so to speak, might come. And so I'm really just trying to carve out a niche for other people, not so much for myself. I think I've done well for myself thus far, and I think my future will be well as well. But the diversity aspect is really about just creating room for other incarcerated people to have a chance, or formerly incarcerated people to have a chance. Because, like I said before, some of the most brilliant and capable minds have I met behind the walls. Even since I've been from behind the walls, but I continue to work with people on parole, probation, or in other stations of life where they've been touched by the criminal legal system. Uh, the only difference, I think, for these folks is that many of them just haven't had an opportunity. Oftentimes, people who experience criminal legal issues, who experience prisons and jail, often are starting out from a very disadvantaged position, and then so when they go inside these institutions of justice, or as Richard Pryor once said, just us. When they find themselves inside these institutions, they become debilitated and not rehabilitated. And so when they come back to the community, they have less to give than they did before they went in there. So I hope that answers the question. I kind of went off on a tangent, but again, thank you for your question.
No, thank you for the response and being so candid. Just kind of a fact, we're seeing more and more women even being incarcerated. So it's not just, Black males or male of color. We're also seeing this transcend to other cultures and other genders. And it's something that, it's something that has oppressed. So
Yes.
any strategies we can to move forward in that. But are you seeing that? Are you seeing that more women are impacted as well?
Absolutely, and the research bears this as well. The research shows that women are the fastest growing group of incarcerated citizens in the United States of America. And also, what happens is that women, they receive the least amount of support while incarcerated and post incarceration. So oftentimes their outcomes are even worse than the men. However, it seems that the women are the one who need more support, particularly speaking about or speaking to the fact that many of the women who are incarcerated are mothers. And so they need help reconnecting with their families. They need help learning how to work through the trauma. Same with men, but learning how to work through the trauma of incarceration so that they can return to being nurturing mothers and good citizens. Yeah.
Can I
Thank
can
you.
I, can I
Thank you.
say something
Yes, Wes,
real
go ahead.
quick? I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Number one, Dr. Craig, you don't have to apologize for tangents because you're on the panel with me, and that's my whole game here. So, and bonus points for referencing Richard Pryor. Like, this has been a complete Friday. So it's been a wonderful Juneteenth panel we've had here. So a point that you had made about the lack of opportunities that incarcerated folks get, right? I wanted to expand on that because, right, we have the overlap with incarcerated folks, obviously folks of color, and also neurodivergent folks and folks who have disabilities, right? And so, like, neurodiversity is not necessarily disability. It can overlap. Some folks who are neurodivergent consider themselves to be disabled. Some do not. That's a whole workshop in itself. But when they do get opportunities, neurodivergent folks, incarcerated folks, they're watched under a microscope. It's. I'm gonna also do a comedic reference. There was a Chris Rock line that said, the sky's the limit, but for other folks, it's the limit's the sky, right? So when you're under a microscope all the time and you make a mistake that an employee who came through the normal traditional like pipeline and looks more or less like everyone else, whether physically or on paper, when they make the same mistakes, it's not usually a big deal, right? It would have to happen several times. But when someone who's autistic or ADHD, dyslexic, incarcerated, they have some type of disability, or there's an overlap of those things, it's like, oh, well, is this a sign that they really can't do it? Is this a sign that they can't cut it? This is an important distinction to make when we are doing like evaluations on our colleagues or our supervisees, or looking at key performance indicators, and we're saying, well, hey, you didn't really measure up to this. Well, okay, why? How many other people are doing this? And that impacts promotion, that impacts salary. And so all of these issues that folks on this area are already experiencing become exacerbated, because now, all right, it's already harder for me to get an opportunity. Now I got an opportunity, I'm under the microscope and I'm getting paid less. Now I can't get promoted. My quality of life stays the same. I got all these other costs. This is that think of it like compounding interest. All of these aspects. This is what intersectionality really is. It's the impacts of these marginalized identities. This is what it does.
Wow.
Wonderful. Thank you. We're going to solve some problems today, right? And we're going to put it all on Shea to help us solve some of these problems. But we heard earlier, Wes, you mentioned about the Great Resignation. We know there are people who are ready, they're willing, they're able, but they've been on the bench. they really haven't had the opportunity to engage, to get jobs, quite frankly, right? This is impacting people's lives. What are some critical changes that we can do, some critical, really critical changes and strategies to really achieve this diversity in the workplace and get people into these positions?
I guess I'll hop in on that one. Honestly, it's the approach that we take when we're recruiting. I feel like a lot of organizations and corporate organizations, they mainly rely on LinkedIn, they mainly rely on their talent portals, or they mainly rely on individuals applying to their website. You have to take it a step further. You have so many different type of organizations, whether it's tech, whether it's in, healthcare, whether it's in marketing, where their companies are not known to individuals, their technology stack, their processes. You have to take a step further and go out there and educate. And a lot of times that does not always result in immediate applicants or employees within your organization. They may take those skill sets, that education or certification that you provide, and go to a different organization. But you are nurturing the market, and that's the key, is you are nurturing the market as a whole. So as we see with the Great Resignation, people are jumping from company to company, boomeranging back to companies that they previously were at. Eventually those individuals, and I see it so often, especially now, people that have participated in a code-up class that I volunteered and gave some education with, or people that have went through our certification program that is free to veterans or veteran spouses. They took those skill sets and went to one company, and now they're knocking on my door. Hey, I see this position at Red Hat, and I'm okay with that. They have the skill sets. They know what we're all about. They know our technology. So it's taking a step further and really implementing your CSC and your CSR into your recruiting, really doing the relationship recruiting, maintaining those relationships. It's okay if you reach out to someone and they're no longer interested in your organization. What you're going to do is go back a few months later, continue to see what challenges they are facing. The other thing I think is extremely important is being in touch with your inner diverse community. So a lot of times we have ERGs, you have organizations within your infrastructure of diverse groups, connecting with them, seeing what their networks look like, seeing what part of nonprofits they're a part of, really understanding what are the challenges they're facing. One thing I make everyone on my team that I manage understand is get to know the challenges that diverse individuals are facing. Why aren't they applying to our company? Why aren't they out there? What are some of the things that are limiting them? And then address those issues individually. And sometimes, especially when it comes to neurodiverse or when it comes to the pride community, individuals with disabilities, it's we're not sure we want to apply. We don't know if this is going to be a remote position. We're not comfortable coming in person. We're not sure if you have accommodations. We're not sure about your healthcare system, because what we may not realize a lot of times in recruitment, especially if you're not focused in diversity, is that compensation is not everything to everyone. At times there, you have to worry about healthcare benefits. Healthcare benefits may be perfectly fine for me, but someone who uses a wheelchair or crutches consistently, that has to buy replacement parts on a consistent basis, what does that deductible look like for them? What does their copay look like for them? Those are conversations they want to have. So it's taking a step further than just recruiting and really building a relationship and doing a deep dive into what are the needs of diverse communities, and then volunteering, getting your services out there. But while you're out there, making sure that you are promoting inclusivity, you are showing them that there's a space for them within your organization, that you have accommodations, that you have career paths. I think as a whole, we all need to move from this transactional recruiting and really into building relationships.
Wonderful. Thank you. With the power 5, 6, or 7 minutes that we have, I wanted to ask Wes, Craig, and then Shea, what would be one thing you hope individuals in the audience today can do, should do as a result of our conversation today? We hear a lot of people say, I want to make change. I want to be that champion, that advocate. to speak to their heart and mind, what could they do today? I'll start with Wes.
Saying one thing is always hard for me, so I'll say something really broad is challenge your processes, right? Your internal processes, your recruitment processes. And when I say challenge, sit down, write them down on a piece of paper or type them out on a piece of digital or digital document here, and really look at what these steps look like what has to happen through this process. And when you see things like that, you can conceptualize it in a different way. So then, and by the way, people do this in like UX and other things as well. Like have a persona that you build. Like, okay, if this person who looks and sounds and thinks like this, how would they work through that process? And if you're not sure, then there's plenty of literature out here. We're in the information age. This is Google is a thing, right? And so we can think about this. People like to rely on data, which data is good. It's a good piece to help us inform these decisions. You can do internal studies, if you want to call it that, for your own organization to understand, and they can be anonymized, to understand how people think and feel about these processes. What was it like for them? And that can that can be a starting point, right? Like pick something like, how does promotion work? Write it down. Like, how do people get promoted? Do they understand? Do they know? What are some of the barriers? And then you can start to see some of these things. So challenge your processes. To start challenging your processes, write them down so you see that they are clear, and then start picking them apart and understanding them at a deeper level.
Wonderful. Thank you. We always hear the adage, what gets measured gets done. So I appreciate you adding that touch point for measurement. Craig, what about you? What's one thing you hope the audience can glean from today? What can they do?
I was thinking about what Wes had said, but in that regard, though, I'll reference another artist, Michael Jackson. Start with the man in the mirror. So we have to begin looking at ourselves first, looking at or understanding, our own implicit biases, and then just lastly, I would say, to remember that talent and skill can come from anywhere, and it does not look oftentimes the way you expect it to look. It's not always packaged the way you expect it to be packaged. And I'll leave it at that.
So true. And I do like the musical piece to that. I was a Michael Jackson fan, so he's very inspiring. Shea, take us home. Tell us a little bit about what you think the audience should do today as a result. Even if you want to just kind of touch upon what you heard from the other two panelists too about looking at practices and looking at the data and the measurement, what could we do to move us forward?
Honestly, I'm actually gonna touch on something that helped me. And years ago, I basically took a free education course on DEI in the workplace, in the structure, to truly get an understanding. Once you're going through that course, it automatically starts making you look at your internal structure and seeing where the changes need to be implemented. So for those that are interested in further educating yourself, to kind of take an overview of what you can possibly speak out on, I would definitely say one course that I've often tell interns that I'm working with is look into Coursera DEI in the workplace. That is definitely one that will give you a high overview of the different areas that you can take a look into and see if there's processes that can improve. And the second thing is just do not be afraid to speak out. Nothing can be done, no progress can be made unless you're willing to sit there and make a change.
Wonderful. Well, I thank you all for bringing your wisdom to us. I'm going to turn over to Evan. I believe, Evan, you're going to moderate the question and answer for us.
Yeah, I've been looking through the chat. We have several comments, but there were two questions. One, and you may not be able to speak to it specifically at a state level, but and I know you all talked about it a little bit, but how you can reduce bias when just selecting candidates to interview in the context of HR requirements and what's on the application. The question asked specifically at a state level, but just from your experience or the organizations you work with, what are some ways to reduce bias when selecting candidates to interview?
Resume redaction's one that I think is tend to be key. Oftentimes people do not feel like they have bias, but when you start redacting resumes, you're redacting their names, you're redacting universities that they attend, associations that they have. You're only able to look at their skill sets. So implementing something similar to a resume redaction, as well as really reviewing the requirements, going from 4 years required to 4 years, or other. So adjusting how you view skill sets and requirements on those on the actual selection for interview process.
Thank you. Thank you.
I 100% agree with Shea. Redacting resumes is huge. Also, job descriptions, how they are framed, how they are worded. I know overwhelming majority of state government roles usually have a salary range in there, and I work for myself currently, but if I decided I was going to re-enter the full-time salaried workforce, I'm not applying to anything that doesn't have a salary range on there because there's a lot of information to understand. And I understand look, I've worked in corporate. I know that there's some reasons I've heard that make sense, but we are trying to make decisions about what we do with our lives, right? And money is a part of the fuel that helps us to navigate this space. And I don't want to go all the way through a 5-part interview process to find out the offer is going to be 30,000 below what I really need. That's just you just wasted my time, and you wasted yours as well, right? So having clear, concise job descriptions, ones that aren't too long, ones that are not too short, that the qualifications actually speak directly to the role of what that is, and that have some clarity to that. So one, it's going to help people just process that better as well, right? Another piece in selecting candidates to interview, I would say if you're looking at interns or recent college graduates, take out the GPA piece. I know it's not popular for a lot of people. Shay, you probably gonna have shit. You're like, oh my gosh, no, right? Like I don't. This is something we did when we were at NC State. I would always. It wasn't just me. We would ask, how do you know a student with a 3.2 is going to perform better than a student with a 2.7? And I'm not asking that question to be smart. I'm like, maybe you have some data, maybe you did a study and you could tell me internally that you have evidence. Most of the time, there is no evidence for this. Okay. I barely graduated from NC State from undergrad. I did horrible in undergrad. I was a mess. I did not have a system in place for all my ADHD complications that was going on. But here I am with multiple degrees and getting a PhD. I can do the work, right? So this is look at your processes. Who is this limiting? Those would be some of the things that I would add as well.
Craig, I didn't know if you had anything you wanted to add before we close here.
Yeah, I think just a couple of suggestions I think might also help is perhaps using an interview guide or using standardized questions or should I say perhaps having multiple people interview a candidate. And so those are three of the things that come to my mind as I think about eliminating bias in the interview context.
Oh, thank you. Well, for the sake of time, we'll go ahead and close out here. So I want to first thank you, Tanya, for agreeing to moderate and lead this conversation. Thank you to all three of our panelists, Shea, Craig, Wes, for your amazing and informative discussion today. And then thank you to all the attendees for joining us for this Lunch and Learn session, specifically around diversity recruiting, hiring, and on-the-job training. Remember, if you do have any additional questions or anything that you would like to share with the panelists, or if you would like to have the panelists connect out to you, make sure you reach out to me, Evan Grant. That's evan.grant@doa.nc.gov. You should have received the calendar invite from me. With this being the last session, we do want you to take everything that you've learned and experienced over the past 3 months and apply that to the work that each of you all do in your respective organizations. Don't just let it sit in your mind without you taking any action behind it, but find ways to institutionalize these practices in the businesses that you represent. What we'd also like you to do is immediately after you get off of this this webinar, is we want you to get connected with this work that's happening within our state agency. So we want you to go to our Department of Commerce and look at their Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Office page, get connected, figure out what they're telling the businesses in North Carolina they should be doing in order to promote these diverse, equitable, and inclusive practices, because that also allows an opportunity for your businesses to continue to communicate with the state on what the state should be incorporating in its efforts. Then we want you to check out the Department of Administration's, our office's Office of Historically Underutilized Businesses, and learn about the vendors who are out there who have the ability to become part of that diverse supplier network that you all offer within each of your organizations. And then also check out our Department of Transportation's Office of Civil Rights. And go look at the work that they're doing there, particularly as it pertains to the work in transportation and how we're starting to see infrastructure development and how that impacts globally for a lot of diverse communities across the state. So definitely, commit to being connected to the work of the state, not just through coming to webinars, but also informing yourselves and taking that information back with you to the organizations that you are a part of. What I also would like to say is, don't forget, it is Juneteenth weekend. There are a lot of festivals and remembrance celebrations and informative celebrations happening throughout the state. I think there are like 5 just in like a 2-mile radius from downtown Raleigh. So there is something you can find to do and learn between today and Sunday. And if you do not know what's happening for Juneteenth, email me and I promise you I can send you several things that you can find out. And if you don't have any clue what Juneteenth is, it's the perfect time for you to figure out what Juneteenth is and be a part of these discussions and a part of this remembrance. Thank you, Wes. I see your comment. But again, thank you to everyone, particularly all of our panelists over these last 3 sessions, to our panelists today, our moderators, and to all of you who are people of North Carolina, whether it's in the business aspect, whether it's you're part of the state work that we do, or if you're part of DEI generally and you just want to be engaged in these conversations. We thank you for being here, being a part of what the Andrea Harris Task Force is doing, but also being a part of what is happening in our great state. So with that, I thank all of you. Again, thank you to Justin Truesdale, who developed and created this space and really thought about how we could bring this to everyone here. And so with that, you all have a great Friday, a wonderful Juneteenth weekend, and we hope to be in touch. Thank you.